There's nothing like soaring across its wide-open skies, down the rows of corn that blanket its fields, and up and over the pinnacles of its awe-inspiring towers. Illinois has always been a land of hope and great change. It was here where a mysterious ancient people built a city more populated than London. It's where a blacksmith named John Deere invented a way to transform tough prairie soil into fields of plenty. And it's where millions fled during the Great Migration, including a guitarist from Mississippi named Muddy Waters. The story of Illinois is one of the most colorful in the nation. It was in this Midwestern state that the founder of the Mormon faith was murdered in cold blood, where the legendary Indian leader Black Hawk was forced into exile, and where mob boss Al Capone turned America's prohibition into his personal empire of organized crime. It's always been one of the nation's most ambitious states, with its great switching yards, hubs for coal and steel, daring engineering marvels, and the house that Jordan built, home of the Chicago Bulls. This is the powerful story of Illinois. There's no better way to understand the true spirit of Illinois than to understand how the skyline of the city of Chicago was born, how it managed to rise from the ashes and touch the sky after one of the most devastating tragedies ever to befall a U.S. city, a tragedy known as the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. It started on October 8th in the southwest of Chicago, in a barn at what is now 137 Tacovin Street. High winds from the southwest fanned the flames and pushed the fire through the city towards Lake Michigan. By the time rain showers finally put the fire out, almost 2 days later, over 4 square miles of the city had been burned to the ground. More than 17,000 buildings were destroyed. 90,000 residents were homeless, and close to 300 were dead. The Great Chicago Fire had started at 9 p.m., which is one reason the tragedy has been called the night America burned. Some say that even before the bricks stopped smoking, the people of Chicago vowed to come back, even bigger than before. And that's just what they did. Chicago's Great Fire was the spark that led to brilliant innovations in the skyscraper and the creation of one of the most dazzling skylines in the world. What first kicked off Chicago's vertical boom was land prices. Almost immediately after the Great Chicago Fire, the cost of land in the city skyrocketed as builders vied for space. Those who did have land wanted to build the tallest structures they could. It just so happened that new building materials were about to make that possible. The one that had the biggest impact was structural steel. It allowed engineers to design taller than ever before by using a skeleton of steel instead of thick walls of stone. It also enabled architects to revolutionize the way buildings looked. The interior steel skeleton made it possible to use large plate glass windows on the outside, which quickly became the norm. When German architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe arrived in Chicago just before World War II to teach here at the Illinois Institute of Technology, he pushed the use of glass and steel in skyscrapers even further. His students went on to design some of Chicago's most important structures, including Lake Point Tower, with its signature curving facade. But steel was also used to reinforce concrete in new ways. When they were built, these corncob-looking towers, known as Marina City, were the tallest buildings made from reinforced concrete in the world. They were also the highest residential buildings ever built, and the first to be constructed with tower cranes that are now a common sight on just about every construction project around the globe. The Chicago Skyline is basically the product of a series of daring experiments in engineering and design. The giant X's on the outside of the city's famous John Hancock Center are a perfect example. They aren't just for decoration. This 100-story tower is actually engineered as a giant steel tube. Its rigid exterior walls are what hold it up. It's an engineering design called an exoskeleton and was developed by a Bangladeshi-born engineer named Fazlur Khan. The John Hancock Center's distinctive diagonal braces help make the tube more rigid. They also create more usable space on each floor, since there's no need for heavy structural supports on the inside. It was the second tallest building ever built when it was completed in 1969. The innovative engineering behind it has since been used to build many other skyscrapers around the world, including the crown jewel of Chicago's skyline, the Willis Tower. It shoots up more than 1/4 of a mile into the sky. When it was completed in 1973, it was called the Sears Tower and was the tallest building in the world. It later lost that title, but maintained its place as the highest structure in the U.S. until 2014, when New York City's One World Trade Center opened its doors and topped the Willis Tower by almost 50 feet. Chicago is not the ideal place to build a megastructure like this one. The ground under this city is actually soft clay, which caused some early buildings here to sink in the mud. Chicago City Hall was one of them and had to be torn down. But architects and engineers here were persistent. By the time the Willis Tower was built, they knew they had to drill more than 100 piles deep down through the clay until they hit bedrock. So the towers above would have something solid to rest on, and so they wouldn't topple over. The Willis Tower was also constructed with a tubular design. But instead of just being one very tall tube, it was engineered as 9 different tubes bundled together. It's what gives the Willis Tower its unique block-like shape. The center and largest tube is the tallest. One reason it gets narrower as it rises is so there's less surface area at higher elevations that could make the structure unstable in high winds. But still, on stormy days in the windy city of Chicago, the highest floors of the Willis Tower can sway as much as 3 feet. And that's another reason why stepping out into one of its skyboxes on the 103rd floor is such a thrill. One thing that makes Chicago a city unlike any other in the nation is how it suddenly rises from a very flat landscape. Out to the west, beyond Chicago's skyscrapers, there are almost no distinctive shapes on the horizon. No mountains, no hills, almost no natural forms at all. Illinois is one of the flattest states in the nation. Stand in the middle of it, and it's possible to imagine that the world itself is actually flat. In fact, Illinois is the second flattest state after Florida. It got that way over millennia, thanks to massive glaciers that once covered almost 85% of the state. They succeeded in completely leveling Illinois' once hilly terrain. But the slow-moving ice also carried with it great riches. When they finally retreated, almost 10,000 years ago, they left behind mineral deposits and a healthy layer of topsoil. It's one reason Illinois now has more than 76,000 farms, and why they can produce 7% of all U.S. agricultural exports, from soybeans to wheat to the king of all Illinois crops, corn. Illinois is the second biggest producer of corn in the nation, after Iowa. For many farmers here, 2014 was their best year on record. Some fields produced more than 200 bushels an acre. But not all Illinois farmers harvest all the corn they grow. Some turn it into art. This is not any old corn maze. It's one of the largest corn mazes in the world. This year it celebrates the 50th anniversary of the Beatles' first album. It lies on the Richardsons' family farm. To create this elaborate design, they have to plant the corn evenly across the field instead of in rows. They hire corn maze artist Sean Stallworthy, who first creates a design on a computer. Then, when the corn is 12 inches high, Stallworthy cuts the design into the field using a tractor armed with GPS. It's an amazingly precise technique. On the ground, it's hard to know which beetle is which, but from the air, it's easy to spot Ringo, George, John, and Paul. Today, farms like the Richardsons cover almost 80% of the state. But before settlers arrived here, about 60% of Illinois was covered with prairie that was very hard to farm. When the glaciers retreated, they left behind a nutrient-rich land. But they also packed the soil here so densely that settlers struggled to drive their plows through Illinois' tough prairie soil. In 1837, a blacksmith named John Deere decided to find a solution. Deere was living in this simple house here in the town of Grand Detour when he decided to try and design a new plow that would be better suited to Illinois' hard prairie soil. In his small blacksmith shop out back, he made a plow with polished steel instead of cast iron. The polishing of the steel made it slippery so that it could cut through the soil and not stick to it. The John Deere steel plow worked and radically improved cultivation across Illinois. It also spawned a whole series of other inventions and machines that still work Illinois fields today. There's nothing like seeing the city of Chicago on the horizon. It shoots up from Illinois' flat plains like the outline of a futuristic metropolis. The tops of its buildings actually touch the sky. But this isn't the first time that man-made structures in Illinois have inspired awe. More than 1,000 years ago, on a site in what's now the southwest corner of Illinois, an ancient people were building skyward, but without the benefit of modern engineers, steel, and glass. They used earth instead, which is why they were known as mound builders. These giant earthworks served as the foundations of what were likely some of the tallest standing structures in North America. They belong to a mysterious and long-lost civilization known as the Mississippian culture. Their settlements once stretched from the Great Lakes region all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico and as far west as the Great Plains. But the Mississippians' largest city was here in Illinois. It's a site now known as the Cahokia Mounds. Archaeologists believe that there were once 120 mounds here, spread over 6 square miles. Building them required moving 55 million cubic feet of earth by hand in woven baskets. A fence like this one once surrounded the city, probably for protection against invaders. In the center is the largest known prehistoric earthwork in the Western Hemisphere. It's called Monk's Mound and forms the shape of a trapezoid. No one knows for sure what role these mounds played in the lives of the Mississippians, but those who were permitted to climb to the top of Monk's Mound would have looked out over a bustling city of up to 20,000 people. By the year 1250, it was more populated than the city of London. Radiating out from the center were fields and smaller villages with smaller mounds. But by 1400, the people living here were gone. No one knows what happened to the great Mississippian mound builders. They simply vanished. French explorers and fur traders were the first Europeans to paddle down the Mississippi River. They began building a series of forts along the river to protect themselves and their trading interests. The most important one stood on the Mississippi's eastern bank, in what's now Illinois. The first French fort here was made of wood and was commanded by a man named Major Pierre d'Artiquette. In 1735, he led a campaign to subdue members of the Chickasaw tribe downriver. But the tribe managed to take him and more than 15 other Frenchmen hostage. The Chickasaw then tied them to stakes and burned them all slowly to death to send a message to the French about infringing on Chickasaw land. It was one reason why the French decided to build a bigger and even better fort here in the 1750s, to keep the Indians at bay and the British from seizing control of the Mississippi Valley. France spent $1 million building Fort de Chartres out of stone. It had its own powder magazine, where gunpowder and weapons could be stockpiled. It earned praise from a member of the Royal British Engineers in 1766 who called it the best-built fort in North America. The British finally did take control of the region and the fort. By the 1850s, one of the great fortifications of the colonial age had fallen into ruin, thanks to its low position near the often flooded Mississippi. It has since been reconstructed. Every fall, thousands of American white pelicans soar through the middle Mississippi Valley on their annual migration south. During the summers, these birds live in the northern U.S. and southern Canada. But every October, they head to the Gulf of Mexico for the winter. Many use the Mississippi River Valley to get there, which means they fly right past the twin cities of St. Louis, Missouri and East St. Louis, Illinois. On the Missouri side is the state's famous Gateway Arch. When it was designed by architect Eero Saarinen in 1947, he also envisioned a park on the Illinois side of the river in East St. Louis to connect the two sister cities. The park never got built, so a prominent local lawyer decided to complete Saarinen's original vision and create something for his city to be proud of. He bought up land and then gave East St. Louis a towering landmark of its own. A giant geyser that shoots water as high as 630 feet into the air, the same height as the St. Louis Arch. Today, it's the highest fountain in the United States. The four smaller fountains at its base represent the four rivers that join near East St. Louis: the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Merrimack, and the Illinois. Even before bridges were built over the Mississippi, East St. Louis was a boom town, though that's hard to believe today from the air. Most of the stockyards, steel plants, and chemical factories that turned East St. Louis into the Pittsburgh of the West are now closed and gone. The Great Depression sent this city into a tailspin that continued after World War II. Starting in the 1960s, there were fewer jobs, fewer people, and with a declining tax base, East St. Louis fell on very hard times. That's when Jackie Joyner Kersey was born in 1962. She grew up in a small house across the street from the Mary E. Brown Community Center with its basketball-shaped roof. It was here where she discovered her athletic talent and started a journey that would earn her the title of the greatest female athlete of the 20th century. For college, Jackie Joyner went to UCLA, and then from there she competed in 4 Summer Olympics where she won 6 medals, 3 of them gold. But she never forgot her hometown of East St. Louis. When the community center where she got her start closed, she spearheaded the building of a new one. Today, the Jackie Joyner Kersey Center offers hope to kids in East St. Louis that they too can live their dreams. And that's why many in Illinois also come here to study at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. It's home to the Fighting Illini, the University of Illinois' football team. A game played here in 1924 against Michigan went down in history for the remarkable runs of a player named Red Grange. In 21 carries, he managed to run 402 yards, which earned him the nickname the Galloping Ghost. The Fighting Illini get their name from the Illiniwek tribes, after which the state of Illinois is named. For years, the mascot of the Fighting Illini was an Indian chief who pranced across the field at halftime, but he was retired in 2007 out of sensitivity to the descendants of the Native Americans who once lived on the prairies where the stadium now stands. But the University of Illinois is about much more than sports. It excels in many fields, including information science, engineering, architecture, and art. Its graduates include film critic Roger Ebert, director Ang Lee, and sculptor Laredo Taft. One of Taft's most famous works still stands tall over Illinois' Rock River. Arms crossed, gazing out over his former land, is a figure known as the Eternal Indian. A light on his chest illuminates his face against the trees at night. Taft's 48-foot-high sculpture was completed in 1911 as a tribute to all the Native Americans who once called Illinois home. Over time, it's come to be associated with a Sauk leader known as Black Hawk. The battles he and his people fought with the U.S. government to keep their land here on the Rock River are famously known as the Black Hawk War. One of the most important battles happened here in the state's northwest corner, near the present-day city of Galena. In the 1820s, Galena boomed when lead was discovered in the region. Other settlements were soon established nearby, including one at a place called Apple River. In the spring of 1829, members of the Sauk and Fox tribes returned from their winter hunts to discover that the miners had taken over their villages. The tribes were forced to resettle on land on the west side of the Mississippi. But in 1832, Black Hawk and hundreds of members of the tribes crossed back over the Mississippi to try to reoccupy their land. When miners in Apple River heard the news, they raced to build a fortified wall around their cabins for protection. Their Apple River fort has since been reconstructed. On June 24, 1832, Black Hawk and about 200 warriors arrived and then attacked the fort. But the miners and their wives fired back, and after 45 minutes, Black Hawk decided to give up, thinking he was outgunned. Almost 6 weeks later, the chief and his people suffered a final horrifying defeat when U.S. forces chased them into the waters of the Mississippi and then fired on them at will, slaughtering hundreds of their men, women, and children in what came to be known as the Bad Axe Massacre. Black Hawk was one of the few survivors and later died of illness in Iowa. Today, Laredo Taft sculpture stands as an impressive reminder of what happened to Black Hawk and his people here in western Illinois. In his final speech before he died, Black Hawk said, "Rock River was beautiful country. I loved my towns, my cornfields, and the home of my people. It is yours now. Keep it as we did." The year after the Black Hawk War ended, the city of Chicago was incorporated on the shores of Lake Michigan, and Illinois was about to undergo its transformation from a series of frontier outposts to one of the most powerful states in the nation. One frontiersman who helped drive that transformation was a young Illinois resident named Abraham Lincoln, which is why Illinois proudly calls itself the Land of Lincoln. At the age of 23, Lincoln served in the Black Hawk War, but never saw any action. In July 1832, he returned to his home in the town of New Salem. That town is now known as Lincoln's New Salem Historic Site. New Salem's old frontier buildings have since been reconstructed, including 2 small stores which Lincoln co-owned and ran. The stores weren't much of a success, and Lincoln found himself deep in debt, which is one reason he took another job as New Salem's postmaster. The future president later described himself during this period as a floating piece of driftwood. But that soon started to change when Lincoln began studying law on his own. Then, in 1834, he was elected to the Illinois State Legislature. When the legislature met, Lincoln had to come here to the Illinois state capitol in Vandalia. But in 1837, Lincoln and other legislators voted to move the capital from Vandalia in the south to its present location in Springfield, in the middle of the state. Soon, a stunning new Capitol building was rising over Springfield. When Lincoln moved here that same year, he was still so in debt, he had to buy $17 worth of bedclothes on credit. But he managed to start a law office and begin his nearly 25-year career as a lawyer. The site of his last law partnership still stands just feet from the old State House. Outside is a statue of Lincoln with his wife Mary Todd. It was here in Springfield where they first met, and were married in 1842. The next year, the Lincolns were able to pay $1,200 in cash to buy this Victorian house just a few blocks from his office, and the state capitol, where he would argue cases in front of the Illinois Supreme Court. In 1858, Lincoln used the State House to announce his candidacy for the U.S. Senate just 2 years before he was elected president. In 2007, an Illinois senator named Barack Obama followed in Lincoln's footsteps and came to the old State House to declare that he was also a candidate for the highest office in the land. On May 3, 1865, Lincoln's body was brought to the State House after his assassination in Washington. More than 70,000 mourners arrived here to pay tribute to their martyred president. First Lady Mary Todd requested that the president's body be buried nearby in Springfield's peaceful Oak Ridge Cemetery. But in 1876, the tomb was raided by a gang of thieves who wanted to steal Lincoln's coffin so they could hold it for ransom. The Secret Service foiled the plot, and the burglars were later nabbed in Chicago. Today, his tomb and memorial here have made Oak Ridge Cemetery the second most visited cemetery in the nation after Arlington National Cemetery. Lincoln wasn't the last to make a profound impact on the state of Illinois. Less than 30 years later, oil magnate John D. Rockefeller decided to fund a new university in the Midwest. In 1890, he joined forces with the fledgling American Baptist Education Society to create the University of Chicago. As modern skyscrapers were rising in downtown Chicago to the north, a new English Gothic-style campus with towers, cloisters, and gargoyles appeared here in Chicago's Hyde Park neighborhood, on land donated by Marshall Field, the owner of a legendary Chicago department store. At its center stands the Rockefeller Chapel, named in honor of the university's biggest benefactor. Rockefeller decided to fund a university in Chicago in order to help give the rapidly growing Midwest a first-class educational institution, like those in the already well-served eastern states. He later said it was the best investment he ever made. Today, University of Chicago students hail from every walk of life and every corner of the globe, which is one reason cricket matches are now frequent sights on the campus green. At least 80 Nobel laureates have called its storied halls home, including a former law professor named Barack Obama. In the 1940s, the University of Chicago was the site of a secret government experiment that some feared had the potential to blow up half of Chicago. It happened during World War II, when the U.S. government was racing against the Germans to be the first to harness the power of the atom. The experiment was led by an Italian physicist and professor named Enrico Fermi. It happened here in the middle of campus, near where the glass dome of the Mansueto Library now stands. At the time, this was the site of the University of Chicago's football stadium, Stagg Field. On December 2nd, 1942, in a squash court underneath the stadium stands, Fermi and a team of physicists succeeded in creating the world's first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. The experiment was called Chicago Pile 1, since the reaction was started in a pile of uranium. Most importantly, Fermi and his team were able to control the reaction once it got started. It was a precursor to the development of the atomic bomb. Very few people on campus knew it was even happening, or that it could have leaked radiation under Stagg Field if it had gotten out of control. A sculpture by Henry Moore, titled Nuclear Energy, now marks the site of this historic achievement. No one knows why Moore shaped his sculpture the way he did. He claims it was to inspire those looking up at it to feel like they were in a cathedral. In 1943, the year after Enrico Fermi's atomic experiment, a train wound its way north through Illinois on its way to Chicago. On board was a guitarist from Mississippi named Muddy Waters. Many of his fellow passengers were also arriving from the American South and hoping to find better work and better pay in the bustling industries of Chicago. They were some of the up to 7 million African Americans that left the rural South for opportunities in the North during what's known as the Great Migration. In the 1940s, Chicago was a wartime boomtown, producing everything from fighter planes and torpedoes to parachutes and engines. It was also a hub for raw materials like grain, coal, and steel. Much of it was carried in and out of the city by train, which made Chicago one of the nation's most important transportation hubs. The city also had its own rapid transit system, famously known as the L, since it was an elevated train line. When the first L lines had started snaking across the city in 1892, the Chicago Tribune reported that servant girls, cooks, and chambermaids left their work to watch from back porches the fast-flying trains as they went by. The year after his own train pulled into Chicago, Muddy Waters bought his first electric guitar and began creating his new distinctive electrified blues sound. It would go on to be known as Chicago Blues. Waters had grown up picking cotton on a Mississippi plantation, but a decade after arriving in Chicago, he was able to buy this Victorian house on the city's south side and turn the basement into a recording studio. Waters himself is said to have slept in a room just over the studio, so he could listen to all the great music being played down below when he went to sleep. Many of Chicago's great blues musicians passed through Waters' house, but it fell into disrepair after he died in 1983. Musicians, artists, architects, and engineers have all played profound roles in the story of Chicago. One of the most interesting places to ponder their impact is under the curving reflective surfaces of something called Cloud Gate. It's a giant steel sculpture by Indian-born British artist Anish Kapoor that lies in the city's Millennium Park. This 110-ton object was inspired by the shape and surface of a drop of liquid mercury. It's easy to see why locals prefer to call it simply the Bean. Its position here on the edge of the park means it reflects some of Chicago's highest structures, not to mention the sky and clouds after which it's named. The city's phenomenal growth after its Great Fire could easily have turned all the land here on Lake Michigan into sites for new high-rises. But luckily, when Chicago was first being settled long before the fire, a group of savvy Chicago residents argued that the city should preserve an area of its lakefront for public use and that it should be an area free of any buildings. They succeeded, and the city's lakefront park was born. Rubble from the 1871 fire was actually used to expand the park into the lake. It was renamed Grant Park in 1901 in honor of Ulysses S. Grant, Illinois' own Civil War hero. Today, it covers more than 300 acres and is one of the nation's most impressive urban spaces. At its heart is the majestic Clarence F. Buckingham Memorial Fountain. In a city of skyscrapers, a 150-foot-high jet of water may not seem like much unless you're gazing up at it from the ground. When the new J. Pritzker Pavilion was commissioned in 1999, it was deemed a work of art rather than a building in order for it to meet the park's rules. Today, this bandshell is home to the annual Grant Park Music Festival. Designed by architect Frank Gehry, it's one of Chicago's most famous structures, even though it stands just 120 feet tall. It proves that not all buildings in Chicago have to touch the sky to get noticed. That's also the case for the 140-foot-high house that Jordan built, otherwise known as the United Center, home court of the Chicago Bulls. From 1984 to 1999, Michael Jordan ruled supreme here, except for a short break to play Major League Baseball for the Chicago White Sox. The city's other Major League Baseball team, the Chicago Cubs, has its home on the city's north side. In 1915, Wrigley Field was the first professional ball field to allow fans to keep foul and home run balls. That was in the day when it was still named Weigman Park and home to the Chicago Whales. The Cubs arrived here in 1916, and 10 years later, the field was renamed Wrigley after chewing gum magnate William Wrigley Jr. Today, it's the only Major League field where fans can buy seating on top of nearby buildings. Once, fans used to gather here for free, but then the building's owners started charging admission. The Cubs weren't happy and sued for a share of the profits. They won, And now the rooftop owners have to hand over 17% of their ticket sales to the team. For fans, it's still a perfect place to see the Chicago Cubs in action from high above. Journey across Chicago by air, and the rich variety of its structures and spaces can be mind-boggling. But just north of the city, in Wilmette, lies a very unique kind of architectural wonder. A stunning 9-sided temple standing above the shore of Lake Michigan. This is the Baha'i House of Worship for North America and was dedicated in 1953. The Baha'i faith centers on 3 core principles: the oneness of God, the unity of mankind, and the equal validity of all the world's religions. The faith began in 1844 in southern Iran, after a man in the city of Shiraz declared he was a messenger of God, and that the time had come for all faiths to unite. Iran deemed him a heretic and still actively persecutes followers of the Baha'i faith to this day. But there was a time here in Illinois when followers of new religious faiths were also persecuted for their beliefs. That's what happened to the Mormons, and why the Church of Latter-day Saints is now based in Utah, not Illinois. In 1839, Joseph Smith and the followers of his Church of Latter-day Saints arrived here on a bend on the Mississippi River in western Illinois. Smith named their new settlement Nauvoo, based on an old Hebrew word that means beautiful place. Today, Nauvoo lies near where the states of Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri all meet. The Mormons had already been harassed in New York, Ohio, and Missouri. Here on the banks of the Mississippi River, Smith hoped they would finally be able to live and practice their faith in peace. The Mormons quickly established a new town here, with stores, a bank, and neighborhoods of distinctive brick houses. It was all planned to be centered around a grand Mormon temple that looked a lot like this modern one does today. The house Smith and his family lived in still stands here on the edge of town. Life in Nauvoo proved challenging from the start. In the first 7 years, 2,000 Mormons died, many from malaria, tuberculosis, and fever. Yet, thousands flocked here from as far away as the British Isles to join the church. At its peak, Nauvoo had a population of 11,000, making it one of the largest cities in Illinois, and one that rivaled Chicago at the time. But as the community grew, so too did tensions with other Illinois settlers, due to the Mormons' increasing power, exclusivity, and rumors that Joseph Smith and his followers practiced polygamy. The church itself confirms that Smith had at least 40 wives while he was in Nauvoo. Some were as young as 14. Some others were already married when they married Smith. Even though he tried to keep his multiple marriages a secret, outrage against the Mormons was growing. And then, things erupted. Smith, who was also Nauvoo's mayor, ordered the destruction of the printing presses of a local newspaper that was highly critical of the church and Smith's practice of polygamy. When that happened, there was public outcry, and many feared that the Mormons in Nauvoo would be attacked. Illinois Governor Thomas Ford finally stepped in and convinced Smith and his brother to face trial. "I am going like a lamb to the slaughter," Smith is reported to have said. The two were brought here, to the nearby town of Carthage, where they were put in this small jail. But when word got out that they were here, an anti-Mormon mob descended on the jail. On June 27, 1844, gunmen finally broke down the door and shot both Smith brothers to death. Their bodies were returned to Nauvoo and buried next to their house. Their graves are now a pilgrimage site for followers of the church. Within 2 years, led by their new leader, Brigham Young, the Mormons began their epic journeys west, often on foot, to the promised land of Utah. Generations later, the Mormons reacquired the lot where the old temple stood, and in 2002, they dedicated a brand new temple, reconstructed to look exactly like the one their ancestors had left behind. And now, every summer, members of the Mormon community stage a pageant near the temple to remember their fallen leaders and celebrate their return to Nauvoo. The Mormons who left Nauvoo didn't get a chance to witness Illinois' great boom as the 19th century came to a close. It was a boom that created the perfect conditions for the rise of one of America's most legendary gangsters, mob boss Al Capone, also known as Scarface. As workers flooded into the city, tensions flared between different racial and ethnic groups. The city government also struggled to provide basic services. Criminals filled the void. But organized crime in Chicago exploded when Prohibition kicked in January 1920. The city's location on Lake Michigan, in the center of the country and close to Canada, made it a perfect hub for the illegal liquor trade. By the mid-1920s, there were more than 1,300 gangs in Chicago. Their leaders had colorful nicknames like the Scourge, Mossy, Big Steve, Dutch, and Spike, and were given almost celebrity treatment in the press. But none was more famous than a gangster named Al Capone, who arrived in Chicago from Brooklyn in 1920. He began by working for Chicago's underworld kingpin, Johnny Torrio, here in the suburb of Cicero. Capone frequented the now famous Klaus restaurant. It's said he ran a brothel upstairs and bought off every politician in town. But after his own brother Frank was gunned down by the police in Cicero's streets, Capone knew he would have to do whatever it took if he wanted to expand his operations and survive. When he finally took over from Torrio in 1925, Capone was just 26, but already in charge of an empire funded with everything from prostitution to bribery to gambling, robbery, and murder. But there was no business more lucrative than bootlegging. Capone's men smuggled alcohol into and all over the city, to clubs like this one, the Green Mill Cocktail Lounge. Musicians are said to have played his favorite song, Rhapsody in Blue, the moment Capone walked through the door. It was one of his favorite hangouts and had secret underground tunnels for his men to move the booze. It's now a respected jazz club, but the hidden Prohibition-era elevator behind the bar is still there. As Capone's men, armed with Tommy guns, worked to expand their boss's power over Chicago, they turned the city streets into a war zone. The cornerstone of the Holy Name Cathedral still has bullet marks from a gun battle between Capone's men and their rivals in 1926. The violence finally came to a head in 1929 on Chicago's North Side. It was here, on Valentine's Day, that Capone's henchmen dressed in police uniforms lined up 7 members of a rival gang against the wall of a parking garage that used to stand on this open lot. Then, they shot them dead. The brutal killings came to be known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and forever sealed Chicago's reputation as a hub of organized crime. Then, on a warm July night in 1934, the notorious Indiana gangster John Dillinger, who was on the run, stepped out of Chicago's Biograph Theater after a movie. That's when FBI agent Melvin Purvis lit a cigar to send a signal to his fellow agents. They opened fire on Dillinger as he ran for cover. 5 shots were fired. 3 hit Dillinger and brought him to the ground. 1 went right through the back of his neck and out one of his eyes. It was the shot that killed him. Illinois has been home to many other notorious criminals since Dillinger. But some of its most famous convicts have been those elected by the public to the highest office in the state, here in the new state capitol in Springfield. Since the 1960s, 4 Illinois governors have done time in federal prison. Otto Kerner was convicted of bribery. Dan Walker did his time for bank fraud. George Ryan was convicted of 18 felonies, including racketeering, but got out early for good conduct. Finally, there's former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich, who's currently serving a 14-year sentence for 17 corruption-related charges related to his attempt to sell President Barack Obama's former Senate seat. Giant glaciers may have been responsible for leveling much of Illinois, but they didn't succeed in flattening everything. Down on the state's southernmost tip, this is the Shawnee National Forest. It's home to some of the most dramatic landscapes in all of Illinois, and a place known as the Garden of the Gods. Starting about 320 million years ago, wind and rain began whittling away the mountains here and exposing these dramatic sandstone forms. Today, trails wind through these rocks, which offers stunning views over the largest piece of protected public land in Illinois. This state is not well known for its wild spaces, but the Garden of the Gods proves that Illinois is full of surprises. It's a land where people have always reached for the sky. From its mysterious ancient mound builders, to the Native American tribes who followed, to those who looked out over smoldering Chicago and already knew that it would rise from the ashes even greater than before. This is the true spirit of Illinois.